we're going to talk about the moments in the medieval era when humanity came alarmingly close to wiping itself out, not because of asteroids, invasions, or mythical beasts, but because of decisions made with absolute confidence and catastrophic consequences. Let's begin with medicine. If medieval medical practices had been subject to customer reviews, those reviews would have been impossible to collect because the customers were usually dead. At the heart of medieval healing was a theory so simple it bordered on poetic. The body was governed by four humors, and illness meant one of them was out of balance. The solution: remove fluids, usually blood, until balance returned, or until the patient stopped complaining forever. This practice, known as bloodletting, was applied regardless of symptoms: fever, bloodletting; infection, bloodletting; a persistent cough, or a bout of melancholy, bloodletting, just to be safe. The logic was circular but firm. Sick people are weak, therefore they must have too much blood. Take it away, preferably fast. Physicians used blades or leeches, often bleeding patients until they passed out. Fainting wasn't a warning sign, was proof the treatment was working. Refusing bloodletting wasn't seen as caution, it was defiance. Doctors who didn't bleed their patients were viewed with suspicion. During epidemics, the practice became lethal. People already weakened by hunger, cold, and infection were bled further, collapsing their immune systems and making recovery nearly impossible. And if a patient worsened, that simply meant not enough blood had been taken. The answer to failure was more of the same. The tragedy isn't just that this happened, it's that it was considered careful, responsible medicine. Humanity didn't just battle disease, it held the door open, invited it in, handed it a blade, and asked it to take its time. And when bloodletting had done its part, dietary advice stepped in to ensure no one recovered too comfortably. During famines and plagues, authorities warned against eating fruits and vegetables, not because they were rotten, but because they were moist, and moisture, according to medical doctrine, corrupted the humors. Apples were suspect. Leafy greens were dangerous. Fresh food was treated like contraband. Instead, people were urged to eat dry, heavy foods, stale bread, dense porridge, meat, and wine. Excellent advice if you were a noble with a well-stocked larder. For the poor, it was a recipe for starvation. In times of scarcity, fruits and vegetables were often the only available nourishment, but eating them felt morally risky. So many chose hunger over perceived impropriety. Even when food was consumed, it often did more harm than good. Heavy meals required energy to digest, energy that sick or starving bodies simply didn't have. Immune systems faltered, and medical authorities doubled down. Perhaps the diet wasn't strict enough. Some even advised against eating during illness, claiming digestion distracted the body from healing. So people ate less, sometimes nothing at all. Children suffered most. Growing bodies deprived of nutrients stopped growing, then stopped fighting disease, then stopped altogether. Entire generations were thinned by famine alone, but by the very instructions meant to guide them through it. And hunger was often framed as spiritually virtuous, a test from God. To starve was to be tested. To die was to have completed the test. Humanity didn't just face food shortage, it layered them with rules, fear, and piety, and nearly starved itself out of existence with remarkable discipline. Then there was water, or rather, the utter lack of understanding about it. Medieval towns operated on a waste disposal principle, best described as out of sight, out of mind. Human and animal waste, rotting food, and other refuse were tossed into streets, dumped into open pits, or funneled straight into rivers. Those same rivers were believed to possess magical self-cleaning powers. What went in upstream, they assumed, simply vanished by the time it reached the next town. Latrines were built directly over waterways. Entire neighborhoods used rivers for drinking, washing, and brewing, hence the popularity of ale. It was safer than water that had recently hosted, well, everything. Diseases like dysentery and cholera spread effortlessly. Cities became disease recycling machines. When outbreaks occurred, no one suspected the water. It looked clear. It tasted fine. Blame fell instead on bad air, sin, foreign influence, or celestial mischief. People burned incense, rang church bells, or fled often, carrying the illness with them. Meanwhile, the water remained untouched, unquestioned, and thoroughly contaminated. Attempts at cleanliness only made things worse. Clothes were washed in the same rivers used for drinking. Slaughterhouses dumped waste into streams. Tanners soaked hides in water that later flowed into wells. It was a perfectly synchronized system of self-destruction. Cities knew something was wrong. Patterns of recurring illness were obvious but without germ theory. They concluded the problem was supernatural, not sanitary. Humanity didn't just poison itself. It did so cooperatively, efficiently, and daily, one cup at a time. When disease kept spreading, despite bloodletting, fasting, and polluted water, people turned to another scapegoat: cats. Cats were quiet, nocturnal, and eerily observant, traits that made them suspect. Associated with witches, demons, and moral decay, they became targets during plagues. Entire communities killed them en masse, convinced that evil felines were spreading divine punishment. What they didn't realize was that cats were the primary predators of ratsand. Rats carried fleas that carried plague. With cats gone, populations exploded. Fleas thrived. Plague spread faster than ever. Yet no one connected the dots. Instead, worsening outbreaks were taken as proof that even more cats needed to be eliminated. Dogs and other suspicious animals were sometimes killed too. Humanity didn't just misunderstand the crisis, it fired its best ally and promoted the enemy. Desperate and seeing no results from existing measures, some turned to public self-flagellation. The flagellant movement swept across Europe. Groups of men would strip to the waist, whip themselves with chains and leather straps, and march from town to town, believing their suffering would appease God and stop the plague. These processions were theatrical, emotional, and densely packed. Sick and healthy alike joined, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. Wherever the flagellants went, plague followed. Instead of containing disease, they turned it into a traveling spectacle. Authorities tried to intervene, but the movement thrived on certainty in chaos. Pain felt like action. Suffering felt like purpose. And so they marched on, spreading disease, while believing they were saving souls. Medieval cities, for all their grandeur, were perfect breeding grounds for disaster. Houses were stacked vertically. Streets were narrow and sunless. Ventilation was non-existent. Animals roamed freely. Waste was dumped into alleys or out windows. Gardilu, if you were lucky. Rain occasionally washed it away, and that was deemed sufficient sanitation in such close quarters. Disease didn't spread, it detonated. One infected person could doom an entire block. Quarantine was impossible when 6 people slept in one room, yet density was seen as safety walls kept out enemies. Crowds offered protection. The idea that people themselves were the vectors of disease was too uncomfortable to accept. When famine or war struck the countryside, refugees flooded into cities only to find overcrowding, filth, and death waiting. Cities weren't refuges, they were slow-burning incubators. And still, people preferred to die together within walls than alone beyond them. When disease breached even those walls, blame had to fall somewhere. Germs were invisible, and medieval minds distrusted the unseen unless it was divine. So instead of microbes, they targeted people, witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, midwives, healers, anyone who stood out. If you lived alone, knew herbs, or ironically owned a cat, you might be labeled a public health threat. Trials were swift, evidence optional, confessions extracted by force. Executions drew crowds, exactly the kind of gatherings disease loved. Persecution caused panic. The accused fled, spreading plague to new areas. The sick hid symptoms for fear of being blamed. And as death tolls rose, it was taken as proof that not enough evil had been purged. So more were accused, more fires lit. This wasn't malice, it was a desperate grasp for control. Humanity didn't just misunderstand disease, it waged war on phantoms and helped extinction along. Meanwhile, medicine ventured into outright poisoning. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, and powders scraped from rocks with no known benefit. These were believed to purge illness. Violently vomiting, diarrhea, and sweating were seen as signs of healing. Mercury was prized for being shiny and mysterious. Patients who survived their illness often died from the cure or lived on with nerve damage and madness. Lead was everywhere, in pipes, cookware, wine, sweeteners, even cosmetics. Chronic poisoning was mistaken for melancholy or divine wrath. Arsenic served as both medicine and murder weapon. The line between dose and death was blurred by imprecise tools and blind faith in authority. During epidemics, desperate people swallowed anything prescribed. Doctors stacked poisons on top of poisons, turning sickbeds into unregulated chemistry labs. This wasn't recklessness, it was cutting-edge science, as far as they knew. Humanity didn't just fight disease blindly, it armed itself with toxins and called it progress. Eventually, death outpaced society's ability to cope. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Graveyards overflowed. Coffins became luxuries. Corpses were left. Eventually, death outpaced society's ability to cope. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Graveyards overflowed. Coffins became luxuries. Corpses were left in homes, streets, and alleys, not from disrespect, but from sheer exhaustion. Mass graves were dug near towns, rivers, and wells, convenient, but disastrously unsanitary. Rain washed decay into water supplies. Insects and scavengers spread contamination further. Fear of the dead also hindered. Burial touching corpses was thought spiritually dangerous, so bodies lingered indoors, poisoning the air. Carts rolled through streets with a call, "Bring out your dead." People obeyed quietly, too drained to protest. Death became routine, administrative. Yet few asked how to prevent it tonely, how to endure it. Finally, there was the tragic paradox of care. People noticed that illness spread among households, but interpreted closeness as compassion, not contagion. Families crowded around the sick, friends visited, neighbors prayed over feverish brows. Leaving someone alone was seen as abandonment, even sinful. Homes were small, smoky, and airless, ideal for disease. Quarantine existed in theory, but collapsed in practice. Merchants resisted, clergy objected, people snuck in and out, and many feared that isolating the sick might anger God, who had sent plague as punishment. Better to suffer together than appear to evade divine will. This wasn't negligence, it was love. But disease doesn't care about love. It sees compassion and thinks more hosts. Even in times of relative peace, most people lived in a state of quiet, chronic hunger. Bread was the staple. If it wasn't so hard, it could double as a weapon. Vegetables were seasonal. Meat was a rare luxury. The average diet was bland, repetitive, and nutritionally inadequate. This wasn't dramatic starvation, it was slow, generational depletion. People grew up undernourished, shorter, weaker, less resilient. Their bodies adapted to scarcity, but at a cost. They were far less equipped to survive the next crisis. Hunger wasn't an event, it was the background hum of daily life, and yet somehow humanity endured through self-inflicted disasters, through poisoned cures, through communal self-sabotage. People survived long enough to eventually stop making these mistakes, not because they were wise, but because they were stubborn. And that stubbornness, flawed, painful, and deeply human, is the only reason we're here, to look back and wonder how they ever made it through at all. But medieval people didn't just endure hardship, they carried its legacy in their very bodies. Chronic undernourishment led to stunted growth, fragile bones, and weakened immune systems. These weren't rare afflictions. They became the norm. Adults entered life already depleted, their bodies lacking the reserves needed to fight even minor infections. A simple fever or wound that might heal easily today could prove fatal than not, because medicine was primitive alone, but because the body had nothing left to give. Then came the truly devastating years. Crop failures, brutal winters, floods, and war. Famine rarely arrived in isolation. It struck populations already worn thin by decades of almost enough. People who had scraped by on meager rations suddenly faced absolute scarcity. Bodies running on empty had no fuel left to burn. Ironically, human behavior often deepened the crisis. During shortages, hoarding became common. Markets collapsed, prices soared, and food, though it still existed, became inaccessible to the poor. Mass death resulted not from total absence of food, but from unequal access to it. Yet hunger was rarely questioned. To complain was to imply one deserved moral notion at odds with prevailing beliefs. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, divine testing, or simply the natural order. From a modern view, this was systemic failure. From a medieval one, it was just life. Humanity didn't merely survive famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse. And yet, despite it all, people endured, thin, exhausted, but astonishingly resilient. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, warfare stood ready. Medieval war wasn't an interruption of peace, it was a constant undercurrent of life. Conflicts dragged on for years, even decades, with armies crisscrossing the same lands, trampling crops, poisoning wells, slaughtering livestock, and burning villages, not out of necessity, but as strategy. The goal wasn't just to defeat enemies, it was to render the land uninhabitable. For peasants, this meant man-made famine. You might survive plague one year, hunger the next, only to wake two soldiers torching your fields because your village lay between two feuding lords. Armies also acted as mobile disease vectors, crowded, unsanitary, and constantly moving. Wherever they marched, sickness followed. Civilians fleeing violence flooded into towns already straining under scarcity. Overwhelming sanitation and food systems, cities became pressure cookers of fear, hunger, and contagion. Even when wars paused, recovery was slow. Fields lay barren, seed grain had been eaten, tools destroyed, and skilled laborers dead. Peace itself was exhausting, and war was never truly. Rare border skirmishes, succession crises, noble feuds, and crusades ensured that one conflict often bled into the next before communities could heal. What looks like madness to us was, to them, simply politics. Humanity didn't just suffer war, it normalized it, built institutions around it, and then wondered why populations kept shrinking. That medieval people survived at all speaks less to clever planning and more to sheer, stubborn refusal to vanish. Their very homes contributed to their fragility. Peasant dwellings were warm but thick with smoke. Open hearths sat in the center of cramped rooms, with no proper chimneys or ventilation. Smoke curled along rafters, sank into bedding, and filled lungs day and night. Coughing, watery eyes, and headaches weren't seen as health hazards. They were signs the fire was doing its job. Children grew up breathing air so dense it would alarm modern physicians. Over time, chronic respiratory damage became widespread, leaving lungs vulnerable when epidemics struck. Some even believed smoke purified the air or warded off evil. So, when disease came, people lit more fires, burned more incense, and inhaled less oxygen. Families slept together in smoke-soaked blankets, night after night. Cold killed quickly. Smoke killed slowly. The short-term threat always won. Humanity didn't just warm itself, it slowly suffocated itself, then wondered why breathing felt like a luxury during plagues. The miracle isn't that people suffered lung disease, it's that they lived long enough to eventually invent proper chimneys. But perhaps the most insidious danger wasn't any single practice, it was a mindset, blind trust in tradition over evidence. In medieval society, knowledge wasn't tested, was inherited. If an idea was old, it was right. If an authority like Galen or Aristotle said it, it was beyond question. Medical texts were copied unchanged for centuries, even when their prescriptions consistently failed. Bloodletting persisted not because it worked, but because Galen had endorsed it. To challenge such wisdom wasn't curiosity, it was arrogance, and far more dangerous than dying. People did notice patterns. They saw that certain water sources made towns sick, that some treatments killed faster than the illness itself. But observation without institutional permission meant nothing. If what you saw contradicted tradition, tradition won every time. Innovators risked ridicule, ruin, or accusations of heresy. Being right too soon was suspicious. Why question wisdom passed down through generations? What were you hiding? This reverence for the past allowed deadly ideas to outlive the people they harmed. Progress moved at the pace of candlelit manuscript copying, and only if the scribe approved. Worse still was the confidence with which society clung to these beliefs. Medieval people weren't uncertain. They were certain they understood illness, the cosmos, and God's will. That certainty delayed progress far more than ignorance ever could. From today's view, this seems like stubbornness. From theirs, it was respect for elders, for texts, for order. Yet, that respect nearly led to extinction. Humanity didn't just struggle against nature, it bound itself to outdated ideas and refused to let go, even as the cost mounted. And yet, it survived. Given the bloodletting, the starvation diets, the poisoned remedies, the sewage-laced water, the extermination of plague-fighting cats, the flagellant death marches, the overcrowded cities, the endless wars, the smoky homes, and the rigid devotion to failed traditions, survival should have been impossible. But here we are. Medieval people didn't survive because their systems worked. They survived because humans are stubborn, adaptive, and relentlessly reproductive even in disaster. Progress didn't arrive as grand revelation. It crept in quietly. Someone noticed isolating the sick helped. Another avoided a certain well. A healer stopped bleeding patients after too many died on the table. These shifts weren't revolutions, they were quiet adjustments, often made without understanding why they worked. What truly saved them wasn't brilliance, but pressure-forged adaptation. When a practice became so lethal, it threatened entire communities. It eventually softened, shifted, or faded, not because society admitted error, but because continuing became impossible. Even then, change was resisted fiercely. The Middle Ages weren't a tale of ignorance awaiting enlightenment. They were the story of people trapped in belief systems that once made sense, slowly realizing those systems were killing the man, arguing about it for centuries. Medieval people weren't uniquely foolish. They did what humans always do: trusted the familiar, obeyed authority, clung to comforting explanations, and avoided uncertainty. Humanity didn't escape the Middle Ages through genius alone. It escaped by surviving long enough to question itself. And honestly, that's still how it works today. At the heart of Norse belief stood Yggdrasil, not as a symbol, but as the literal axis of existence. To the Vikings, the cosmos wasn't an empty void of distant stars. It was a living, breathing, fragile system held together by a colossal ash tree whose roots and branches touched every realm of reality. If Ig fell, everything fell with it. The tree rose from the deeps of creation, its trunk vast beyond measure, its bark weathered by eons. Its limbs cradled the 9 worlds like fruit, groaning not from wind, but from the weight of fate itself. The Vikings imagined a universe that could be herd-strained, aging, slowly unraveling. Yggdrasil was not serene. It was under constant assault. Serpents gnawed its roots, a dragon chewed its base, stags stripped its leaves. Decay wasn't an accident, it was woven into the fabric of reality. Existence was never stable, never safe, never eternal. Even the tree holding the cosmos together was dying. At its roots lay sacred wells. One, Mimir Eswell, granted wisdom but demanded sacrifice. Another, the Well of Ord, was where the Norns wove the fates of gods and mortals alike. These waters nourished Yggdrasil, but also reminded all beings that knowledge and destiny came at a price. Crucially, Yggdrasil connected everything. Gods, humans, the living, the dead doll, shared the same structure. The Vikings didn't see themselves as observers of the universe, but as participants standing on one of its trembling branches. Their lives mattered, not because they were protected, but because they were exposed. This worldview shaped their values. If the cosmos itself was fragile, struggle was natural. If even the gods couldn't stop decay, then courage mattered more than survival. Meaning came not from permanence, but from how one stood while the tree still held. From Yggdrasil's limbs emerged the 9 worlds, distinct, yet deeply intertwined. The universe wasn't neatly ordered. It was tangled, overlapping, sometimes leaking into itself. Asgard, home of the gods, sat high in the branches, a fortress of feasting halls and constant war preparation. It wasn't paradise, but a stronghold. Even the gods lived behind walls, knowing their enemies would one day breach them. Height meant responsibility, not safety. Beneath it lay Midgard, the world of humans. It wasn't central because humanity was important, but because it was vulnerable, encircled by ocean and the great serpent. Jormungandr Midgard stood exposed to chaos from all sides. Life there was a balancing act between order and ruin. Beyond lay Jotunheim, land of the giants, embodiments of raw nature, winter, storm, and famine. Giants weren't evil, they were inevitable. The conflict between gods and giants wasn't moral, it was structural. Control versus collapse. Deeper still, coiled around Yggdrasil's roots, were darker realms, Niflheim, cold and silent, and Hell, where those who died without glory went not as punishment, but as quiet rest. These worlds were never sealed. Gods walked among humans. Giants stormed Asgard. Monsters crossed boundaries when balance failed. Reality was porous, always at risk of rupture. To live in the 9 worlds was to accept uncertainty, to know you were part of a system that could crack at any moment. At the center of this cosmos stood Odin, not a gentle father, but a restless seeker who ruled through knowledge, sacrifice, and dread. To the Norse, wisdom wasn't given, was taken, stolen, or paid for in blood. Odin knew the universe would end. He didn't seek comfort, he sought truth, even when it promised doom. He sacrificed one eye at Mimir's well for deeper sight. He hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, fasting between life and death, not as penance, but as a trap to catch hidden knowledge. From this ordeal, he won the runes, symbols that shaped fate and magic. His rule reflected this philosophy. He offered not safety, but preparation. His ravens flew the worlds gathering news. The dead were laid to rest with weapons, tools, and tokens of who they had been, not because they would use them in the afterlife, but because these objects were their identity. To die stripped of one's story was considered worse than a violent end. Norse belief offered no divine judgment after death. Instead, it promised something more human: recognition. You would not be weighed or punished. You would simply be remembered or forgotten. To the Vikings, dying well meant meeting the inevitable with dignity. The universe would end. Life would end. But how you faced that ending would echo. longer than your last breath, even after Ragnarok. The final, cataclysmic battle. Norse myth did not descend into silence. When the fires cooled and the seas receded, the world was not erased, it was remade. This reveals a core truth of the Norse worldview. Destruction was never absolute. It was transformation, a passage, not an end. The new earth would rise from the waters, cleansed but scarred. Green would return, crops would grow without sowing, the sky would clear. Yet this was not a return to innocence. It was survival after ruin. Memory remained. Some gods would live on. Balder, whose unjust death helped set the end in motion, would return from the underworld, a symbol of renewal and restored balance. His presence didn't undo the past, it softened its edges. Light returned, not because darkness had been vanquished, but because it had already spent its fury. A new generation of gods would walk this reborn world, not in palaces, but among ruins. They would carry the wisdom of failure, not prophecy. Humanity, too, would endure. Two figures, Elef and Elef-Rosser, would hide in Yggdrasil's branches during Ragnarok and emerge afterward to begin anew. Their survival wasn't heroic or glorious, it was quiet, and that quietness mattered. The Vikings understood that most survival doesn't look like legend, it looks like endurance in obscurity. This vision of rebirth reshaped the meaning of struggle. Ragnarok wasn't a warning to behave better. It was proof that collapse was natural. Civilizations fall, gods die, worlds burn, and yet life returns. The reborn world wasn't promised to be better, only to be another chance. Norse myth offered no final victory, no eternal peace, only continuation, memory, and the possibility of repetition. And in that, it found meaning. If something can rise again after total ruin, then enduring hardship, even briefly, is never pointless. The fire will come, but so will the world that follows. For the Vikings, this was not abstract theology, it was lived reality. The cosmos of Yggdrasil, the tension between gods and giants, the certainty of fate, and the inevitability of Ragnarok were not stories told for comfort. They were explanations for why life felt harsh, unpredictable, and fleeting. The universe made sense precisely because it offered no fairness in this framework. Humans weren't insignificant, but neither were they special. Midgard, the realm of mortals, occupied one vulnerable branch among many, exposed to the same chaos that threatened gods and monsters alike. Storms, disease, hunger, and war weren't punishments. They were expressions of a cosmos in constant tension. This shaped a distinct mindset. If suffering was inevitable, dignity mattered more than comfort. If the end was already written, action mattered more than outcome. A person was judged not by success, but by resolve. Fear was understandable, but surrender was shameful. Norse belief also rejected moral reward built into the universe. Good people didn't always thrive. Evil ones didn't always fall. Even the gods lied, cheated, and failed. What mattered wasn't virtue alone, but response. How you met hardship defined you more than the hardship itself. Daily life reflected this cosmic logic. Feasting mattered because famine loomed. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was always possible. Reputation was everything because memory was the closest thing to immortality. To be remembered was to push back against oblivion, even for a moment. And yet, this worldview didn't breed despair. It forged resilience. Knowing even Odin would die didn't weaken faith, it strengthened resolve. If the Allfather couldn't escape fate, then human loss carried no shame. Struggle was a shared condition across all realms of existence. Norse myth offered no escape from reality, alignment with it. The universe was brutal, so humans were expected to be brave. The future was uncertain, so preparation was essential. The end was guaranteed, so meaning had to be made now. To live as a Viking was to stand beneath the trembling branches of Yggdrasil and choose to act. Not because victory was assured, not because salvation awaited, but because facing the storm head-on was the only honorable way to exist. For most of human history, the face was something you never truly saw. You could feel it in the cold, sense it when others looked back at you, recognize it through pain, scars, and expression, but you could not confront it directly. Identity existed without visual confirmation. You were a presence in the world, but your own image remained largely unknown. Early encounters with the self came by accident. A still pond at dawn, a dark pool after rain, a calm stretch of river. For a fleeting moment, a face would appear ghost-like, rippling, distorted by the slightest breath of wind, then vanish. Water refused to hold the self in place. To early humans, this felt uncanny, almost supernatural. Seeing yourself wasn't a tool, it was an event. This absence shaped identity profoundly. Without a stable reflection, the self was built outward, not inward. You knew who you were through your role, your name, your lineage, your deeds. Identity lived in memory and reputation, not in appearance. The body was functional. It hunted, labored, healed, aged. It was not examined. This absence shaped identity profoundly. Without a stable reflection, the self was built outward, not inward. You knew who you were through your role, your name, your lineage, your deeds. Identity lived in memory and reputation, not in appearance. The body was functional. It hunted, labored, healed, aged, was not examined. This may explain why so many early cultures associated reflections with spirits or souls. A face in water felt less like confirmation and more like intrusion. Was that truly you, or something wearing your shape? Many traditions treated mirrors cautiously, even fearfully. To look too long was to risk inviting something back with you. Critically, the lack of mirrors meant no daily confrontation with flaws, no scrutiny of symmetry, no measuring of youth against decay. Wrinkles arrived unnoticed. Scars were known by touch, not sight. Aging happened quietly. Vanity, as we know it, had little room to grow. This didn't mean early humans lacked self-awareness, simply experienced the self through action, not observation, through endurance, not appearance, through story, not image. That balance shifted with the invention of the mirror. The first deliberate mirrors were not glass or metal. They were carved from dark, volcanic stone, polished obsidian, used as early as 6,000 years ago, gave humanity its first reliable way to see itself without distortion. Unlike water, obsidian didn't ripple or vanish when touched. It held the face steady, an act of quiet revolution. The image was dim, shadowed, imperfect, but recognizably human. These mirrors were rare and potent. Crafting them required mining, shaping, and meticulous polishing. They belonged to elites, priests, and rulers. To look into one was not casual, it was ritual. Reflection became something you prepared for. Psychologically, this changed everything. For the first time, a person could observe themselves. The self split into observer and observed. You were no longer only inside your body, you could watch it from outside. This likely felt unsettling. Early mirror users weren't trained to interpret their own appearance. Seeing your face staring back, reversed and silent, may have felt confrontational, even threatening. Many cultures treated mirrors as spiritual portals, objects that could trap souls or reveal hidden truths. Breaking one wasn't mere damage, it was danger. Obsidian mirrors were used in divination, ceremony, and burial rites. Their dark surfaces didn't flatter. They absorbed light, giving reflections a dreamlike, somber quality. Seeing yourself in obsidian was less about beauty and more about recognition, noticing asymmetry, the true shape of a scar, expressions seen rather than felt. This birthed a new form of awareness, visual self-consciousness, and with it came the earliest seeds of self-judgment. Once the face could be studied, it could be compared. Once compared, it could be evaluated. Obsidian mirrors didn't just show who you were, they quietly introduced the idea that the self could be assessed from the outside. As societies mastered metalwork, mirrors evolved. Bronze offered brighter, sharper reflections, human-made and unmistakably controlled. No longer mystical, they became instruments of authority. Found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Mediterranean, bronze mirrors were expensive, fragile, and required constant polishing. Owning one signaled status. Most people lived entire lives without ever clearly seeing their own face. For elites, the mirror became a tool of image management. Hair could be arranged, jewelry placed, expressions rehearsed. Rulers understood that a calm face projected control. Mirrors allowed them to align outward appearance with inner authority. At the same time, brighter reflections intensified self-scrutiny. Flaws became visible. The face was no longer just yours, it was how others might see you. The self became public, even in private. Cultures responded with ritual boundaries, mirrors, covered when not in use, avoided at night, not stared into too long. These weren't mere superstitions, they were psychological safeguards. The human mind was still adapting to the shock of clear self-vision. Bronze mirrors also reinforced social roles, especially gender. Women became increasingly associated with grooming and appearance. The mirror shifted from rare confrontation to daily maintenance. The self was no longer discovered, was managed. Then came glass mirrors. Transformed reflection from privilege into habit. Unlike obsidian or bronze, glass returned a precise, stable, unforgiving image. For the first time, people could see themselves as others likely saw them clearly, repeatedly, without ceremony. As production improved, mirrors entered homes, workshops, public spaces. The self was no longer encountered occasionally, was encountered constantly. This repetition rewired the human mind. Pores, wrinkles, fleeting expressions, all became visible. There was no shadow to hide behind. The face ceased to be symbolic. It became anatomical. Identity shifted from role and reputation to visible presence. With glass came self-monitoring, checking posture, practicing smiles, rehearsing expressions. The mirror became a rehearsal space for social life. The self was no longer shaped only by experience, it was shaped by observation. This precision had consequences. The internal sense of self began to compete with the external image. Someone might feel strong but look tired, confident but see hesitation in their eyes. The mirror exposed the gap between who you felt yourself to be and who you appeared to be, forcing the mind to reconcile the two over time. People learned to imagine themselves from the outside even without a mirror present. How do I stand? How do I look when I speak? The mirror had been internalized. This marked a turning point. Self-surveillance became normal. Behavior was adjusted not just by rules, but by imagined observation. The mirror taught people to see themselves as objects. In social space, this brought advantages: greater empathy, refined communication, but also costs. Comparison became unavoidable. Beauty, youth, symmetry, once fluid ideals, hardened into measurable standards. The mirror, though neutral in intent, became an authority through consistency. It showed the same face every day, regardless of mood or circumstance. It offered no emotional filter. Once reflection became precise, it became impossible to unsee as mirrors grew common. A subtle but profound shift occurred in human consciousness. People began to live with a constant double self that acted and the self that watched. Before mirrors, self-awareness was internal. With them, emotion gained a visual dimension. You could watch yourself feel fear, joy, or age. The mind learned to step outside the body and look back in. This created a permanent tension, the lived self and the observed self. Over time, the mirror trained people to anticipate how they appeared in solitude. The self became performative, even in private. You didn't just feel anger, you watched yourself feel it. You didn't just experience joy, you assessed how it looked. For some, this brought clarity. Harmful patterns could be noticed and corrected. Courage could be rehearsed. For others, it bred anxiety. When the observer never turns off, rest becomes difficult. Silence feels crowded. The mind loses the ability to simply be. Yet this inward turn also enabled deep self-knowledge. Without the mirror, there is no introspection. Without introspection, no deliberate identity. The same tool that fuels insecurity also cultivates consciousness. This is the paradox of reflection. It fragments the self, but also allows it to be shaped with intention. It can trap you in self-criticism, or empower you with awareness. Eventually, humanity no longer needed physical mirrors to see itself. The mirror had become a permanent feature of the mind, watching, questioning, defining who we believe ourselves to be. In the end, the mirror gave humanity something no other tool ever had: direct, repeated confrontation with the self. It added no strength or speed, but it added awareness, and awareness changed everything. Once we could see ourselves clearly, identity became visible, malleable, questionable, and intentional. This brought growth, empathy, self-correction, purpose. People could align how they felt with how they appeared. They could become deliberate versions of themselves. The mirror didn't just reflect the face. It reflected the human condition, self-aware, striving to be seen, and forever shaped by the gaze we turn upon ourselves. But this gift came with a price. To see yourself was to judge yourself, to remember yourself, compare yourself. The mirror made the self measurable, and measurement invites hierarchy. Beauty, youth, and symmetry became currencies. Aging turned from a natural process into something to be tracked, resisted, and concealed. Difference became something to explain or hide. The mirror did not invent insecurity, vanity, or shame, but it gave them a fixed point of reference. Doubt gained a surface. Fear gained a face. The self became both subject and object, actor and audience. This tension remains unresolved. Modern life is saturated with reflections, not just in glass, but in screens, cameras, and digital profiles that extend the mirror endlessly. The question first posed by that earliest polished stone has never faded. Who am I, truly, the one I feel myself to be, or the one I see? The mirror offers no answer. It never did. It only shows, and yet, without it, much of what we call selfhood might not exist. The ability to recognize oneself is the foundation of responsibility, memory, and choice. The mirror fractured the self, but it also made it conscious. In the end, the invention of the mirror did not merely allow humans to see their faces. It forced them to live as visible beings in the world. To be human now is to carry that reflection everywhere, sometimes as insight. So, and yet, without it, much of what we call selfhood might not exist. The ability to recognize oneself is the foundation of responsibility, memory, and choice. The mirror fractured the self, but it also made it conscious. In the end, the invention of the mirror did not merely allow humans to see their faces. It forced them to live as visible beings in the world. To be human now is to carry that reflection everywhere, sometimes as insight, sometimes as burden. The mirror remains what it has always been: silent, precise, and indifferent. It does not tell you who you are. It only asks you to look. By the late Renaissance, Italy overflowed with beauty and chafed under it. Painting had achieved astonishing realism. Architecture learned to command space and stir emotion. Poetry could conjure entire worlds with words alone. Yet music, for all its sophistication, still hovered at the edges of storytelling. It enhanced moments, but did not yet carry them. Music was everywhere, in churches, courts, taverns, but rarely at the center of drama. Characters did not live, change, or suffer through music. Stories were spoken or sung, but never fully embodied by sound. At the same time, Italian intellectuals were captivated by a powerful idea that ancient Greek tragedy had once fused poetry, music, and performance into a single, overwhelming experience, not as background ornament, but as voices conveying emotion, narrative, and meaning as one. Historical accuracy mattered less than the longing it inspired. Renaissance thinkers didn't just want to study the past, they wanted to revive it. They imagined audiences moved to tears, not just by words, but by melody itself, guiding the soul. Italy was uniquely poised for this experiment. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Mantua were wealthy, fiercely competitive, and obsessed with cultural prestige. Patrons craved novelty. Artists sought freedom. Philosophers believed art could shape the human soul. There was also growing frustration with the dominant musical style polyphony, where multiple voices wove together in intricate, often dazzling complexity. But in that brilliance, words were lost, meaning dissolved into sound. If music was to tell stories, something had to change. The stage was set, not by a breakthrough, but by dissatisfaction, a sense that art had reached the limits of its current form. Emotion needed clearer expression. Music needed to speak directly, not decoratively. Opera was not born from arrogance. It was born from a question. What if music stopped decorating stories and became the story itself? That question would reshape Western music forever. The place where this idea first took root was Florence, not because it was conservative, but because it was bold enough to experiment. Florence saw itself as a laboratory of culture, where art was engineered as much as admired. If a new form was to be invented, it would happen here. At its heart was a small, informal circle of poets, musicians, and philosophers, later known as the Florentine Camerata. United not by style, but by shared frustration, they believed contemporary music had grown too ornate to express genuine human feeling. Their radical idea: music should serve the words, not overwhelm them. They theorized that ancient Greek drama had been sung in a speech-like style, where melody followed the natural rhythms of language. Whether this was historically true mattered less than their conviction. They wanted music that spoke. This was dangerous. Polyphony was revered, mathematically elegant, intellectually rigorous. To suggest simplifying it was to defy centuries of tradition. Yet the Camerata pressed on. They imagined a new vocal style, a single voice carrying the text clearly, supported by minimal harmony. Every word would be understood. Every emotional shift would register. Music would no longer blur, meaning it would sharpen it. This wasn't just a technical shift, it was philosophical. They believed art's purpose was to move the listener's inner state. If it failed to do so, no amount of complexity could redeem it. This redefined the performer. Singers were no longer voices in a texture. They became characters, individuals bearing narrative weight. The audience, in turn, was invited to listen not for cleverness, but for feeling. Florence provided the ideal incubator. Wealthy patrons funded trials. Small, tolerant audiences accepted imperfection. Artists were encouraged to test ideas, not repeat formulas. The Camerata never set out to invent opera as a genre. They sought only to solve a problem and, in doing so, opened a door that could never be closed again. But ideas alone were not enough. If music was to become drama, someone had to risk staging it. That leap came at the turn of the 17th century, when composers began crafting works that hovered between music, speech, and theater pieces that had no name yet. One of the first was Jacopo Peri, a Florentine musician under noble patronage. He wasn't trying to create spectacle. He was testing a hypothesis. Could a single voice, shaped like heightened speech, carry an entire story? The result was something strange and new. Instead of interwoven voices, one character sang at a time. The melody followed the natural rise and fall of Italian speech, stretching syllables, tightening others. This style became known as recitative, not fully song, not fully speech, but suspended between them. Early audiences didn't hear masterpieces. They heard experiments. The music was sparse, the accompaniment minimal, the drama intimate. But something unprecedented was happening. Characters weren't pausing the story to sing. They were singing the story itself. Words could finally be understood. Emotion unfolded in real time. Music stopped interrupting drama and began serving it. A character's grief hesitation, or rage could now stretch across musical time, lingering instead of vanishing with spoken words. These early works often drew on Greek myth not for suspense, audiences knew the endings, but for emotional weight. The focus wasn't what happened, but how it felt to move toward fate. Opera began not as popular entertainment, but as intellectual art. Some found the style monotonous, others missed polyphony's richness. Yet even critics sensed something irreversible. Once music learned to speak clearly, it could never return to mere decoration. These fragile experiments proved one essential truth: a human voice, given space and intention, could carry an entire world. But possibility wasn't enough. Opera needed power. That transformation came with Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi understood what others only sensed. For opera to survive, it had to move people. Emotion had to come first, even if rules were broken. Where earlier composers treated music cautiously, Monteverdi wielded it like a weapon, bending harmony, rhythm, and melody to serve feeling. His operas didn't just present stories, they breathed. Characters argued, begged, raged, collapsed. Music followed without restraint. Dissonance became a tool. When a character suffered, the harmony suffered too. When desire surged, music stretched beyond polite boundaries. He also expanded the orchestra's role. Instruments were no longer mere support. They became emotional commentators, coloring scenes with tension, tenderness, or dread. Even silence gained meaning. A pause could wound as deeply as a note. Audiences were no longer passive listeners. They were pulled into characters' inner lives. Mythological figures became recognizably human, full of jealousy, fear, regret, longing. Crucially, Monteverdi proved that clarity and richness could coexist. Words remained intelligible, while the musical world around them deepened. Opera no longer had to choose between intellect and emotion, it could command both. This was the turning point. After Monteverdi, opera was no longer a question. It was a living, compelling art form. Composers across Italy took notice. Courts commissioned new works. Opera began slipping its elite confines. Though still costly, it was no longer restricted to philosophical circles. Its emotional power made it accessible even to those who didn't grasp its origins. Monteverdi didn't achieve perfection. He created momentum. He showed opera could evolve, absorb influences, and deepen over time. Once audiences had felt music think, desire, and suffer on stage, there was no going back. Opera was alive, and living things do not stay contained. Once opera proved it could move hearts, it needed a new home, one more open than princely courts. That home became Venice, wealthy, theatrical, public-minded, and unlike any other Italian city. In Venice, opera entered the marketplace. Public opera houses arose, funded by ticket sales, not a single patron. This single shift transformed everything. Opera now had to appeal not just to elites, but to paying audiences with varied tastes. Myth remained popular, but was reshaped for drama, spectacle, and immediacy. Plots grew intricate, characters more extreme. Love, betrayal, disguise, jealousy, revenge, these dominated the stage. Opera leaned into excess because excess sold. Musically, recitative still drove the story, but arias gained prominence, moments where characters paused action to explore emotion in depth. Audiences came to expect them. Singers became stars, celebrated for expressive power as much as vocal skill. Staging evolved to opera houses invested in elaborate sets, moving scenery, celestial descents, collapsing palaces, indoor storms. Opera became a total sensory experience, sound, sight, and story fused into something overwhelming. Purists worried opera was becoming shallow spectacle over substance. But they missed the point. This was what living art does. Public audiences demanded clarity, emotion, excitement. Opera responded by sharpening its tools. Music grew more direct, characters more relatable, conflict more intense. Venice proved opera didn't need protection to survive. Venice proved opera didn't need protection to survive, needed engagement. When people paid to hear stories sung, those stories gained urgency. Opera stopped being an experiment and became a cultural force. By opening its doors to the public, it gained a voice that belonged not just to artists or patrons, but to society itself. As opera spread across Italy, the human voice became its central battlefield. Composers sought singers who could astonish, voices capable of long, breathless phrases, sudden leaps across octaves, sustained notes that defied physical limits. The voice was no longer just natural, it was trained, stretched, disciplined into something superhuman. This gave rise to the virtuoso singer. Technique became spectacle. Audiences came not only for stories, but to witness near impossible vocal feats. An aria could halt the drama entirely, holding listeners captive through sheer sonic power. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the castrati, male singers altered before puberty to preserve high voices with adult lung capacity. Their sound was unlike any other, powerful, flexible, eerily pure. To 17th-century ears, it was miraculous. They became international stars, commanded huge fees, and shaped how composers wrote. Roles were tailored to their abilities. Emotional expression fused with vocal display. Grief, love, rage, these were no longer just expressed. They were prolonged, magnified, explored in detail. Opera taught audiences how to endure feeling, not just recognize it. Yet this emphasis sparked debate. Was spectacle overtaking story? Were singers eclipsing characters? These tensions never fully vanished, but they signaled growth, not decay. Opera had discovered a truth: the disciplined human voice, unleashed, could carry emotion more directly than any instrument. It bypassed thought and went straight to the body. By pushing voices beyond ordinary limits, opera expanded art's emotional range, asking not just what stories could be told, but how much feeling a human could contain and release through breath alone. As opera matured, its freedom demanded structure. Early chaos gave way to clearer, dramatic architecture. Recitative moved the plot swiftly. Arias paused time, allowing characters to dwell in emotion. A decision already made could be examined from every emotional angle. Desire lingered, regret expanded, triumph unfolded slowly. This rhythm action, followed by reflection, became opera's heartbeat. Librettists learned to design scenes around emotional peaks. Conflict had to justify an aria. Identity became musical. Different cities developed distinct styles. Naples favored vocal brilliance and formal beauty, where drama served music. Other centers prioritized emotional realism. These regional rivalries refined the form through competition, clear character. Types emerged: heroes, lovers, villains, each with recognizable musical languages. Certain rhythms conveyed authority. Certain melodies suggested vulnerability. Audiences learned to read these cues instinctively. Music became narrative shorthand. This structure didn't stifle intensity, it focused. It contained within formal boundaries. Emotion became more potent. A single aria, perfectly placed, could resonate longer than constant musical motion ever could. This balance between control and excess mirrored broader cultural shifts. Europe was organizing itself politically, socially, aesthetically. Passion was still celebrated, but it had to be framed, shaped, delivered with precision. Some mourned early rawness, others welcomed refinement. What mattered was that opera now had a flexible language, able to absorb new tastes without losing its core. By learning to pace emotion, it secured its future. It no longer relied on novelty or shock. It could build tension, release it, and leave audiences transformed. The art form had found its shape. By the early 18th century, opera had outgrown its origins. What began as an Italian solution to a Renaissance problem, how to fuse music and drama, had become a global phenomenon. Italian opera traveled rapidly. Composers, singers, and impresarios carried scores and techniques across borders. Italian became opera's lingua franca, even where it wasn't spoken. Audiences learned to feel through sound before understanding words. Abroad, opera shifted function. In Italy, it was a living dialogue between philosophy, music, and society. Elsewhere, it became a symbol of refinement, power, cultural prestige. Courts built opera houses not just for entertainment, but to signal their place in a sophisticated world. As it crossed borders, opera adapted. Some regions favored grandeur, others moral clarity, or tighter storytelling. Yet Italian foundations endured. The primacy of voice, the alternation of recitative and aria, the belief that music could embody emotion more truthfully than speech. Debates followed it everywhere. Should opera impress or move? Should singers dominate or serve the drama? But conflict sharpened the form. Each challenge forced composers to refine their craft. Italian opera's success revealed a deep truth about human psychology. People don't need to understand every word to feel invested. The voice itself carries meaning through tone, breath, tension, silence. Opera proved that feeling travels faster than language. Its spread also marked a turning point in how art circulated. No longer bound to one place or elite group, opera moved through networks of theaters, patrons, and publics. It became one of the first truly international art forms, yet never fully severed from its Italian roots. The core idea remained: music should serve drama. Voices should embody emotion. What began in Florentine salons now echoed across continents. Opera had escaped its birthplace, but not the idea that gave it life. That human stories deserve voices large enough to contain them. The birth of opera was less the creation of a genre than the birth of a new way of thinking about art. Before, opera, music, and drama existed side by side. After, they became inseparable. Sound was no longer decoration, it became language. Opera proved music could do more than accompany emotion. It could be emotion. A trembling phrase could replace pages of dialogue. A single held note could express indecision, desire, or despair more clearly than words. In doing so, it redefined theatrical truth. Authenticity wasn't about realism, but emotional accuracy. Performers were transformed to singers, became vessels of feeling, expected to merge technique with psychological insight. A convincing performance required not just power, but understanding why a character sings as they do. Audiences changed as well. Listening became active. To follow opera was to read musical cues, anticipate emotional turns, and sit inside extended moments of feeling. Opera trained patience, inviting listeners to stay with emotion longer than daily life allows. Most importantly, opera introduced a lasting idea. Art can heighten reality without escaping it. Its stories might be mythical or exaggerated, but the emotions were unmistakably human. Love hurt the same way. Loss sounded the same. Fear tightened the breath identically. Opera exaggerated form to reach truth. That is why it endured long after. The Renaissance questions that sparked it faded. Even as styles changed and theaters evolved, the core impulse remained. Humans crave stories that feel larger than life, yet truer than words alone. Opera did not replace earlier art forms. It absorbed them. Poetry, theater, music, architecture infused them into one overwhelming experience. That fusion became its strength in the end. Opera succeeded because it answered a deep human need to hear inner life made audible. When music learned to speak, it did not just create a new genre. It gave emotion a voice powerful enough to fill a room, a city, and, eventually, the world.